Good evening and welcome. I'm Azazel, and tonight we'll be continuing our Ghostly Japan story series. In this series, we'll start with an original work of fiction by yours truly that is either an adaptation or influenced by traditional Japanese folklore or urban legends. Afterwards, the real-life source material and history behind the story will be discussed. In tonight's tale, a former U.S. Marine recounts a terrifying experience that he had at the end of the Second World War, and now must face the troubling consequences of his actions on that fateful day in 1945. In tonight's Ghostly Japan story. I know people in town talk about me. If I'm in earshot and they feel like being polite, they'll say I'm eccentric. Otherwise, it's old Gary's the town lunatic. They'll point out to newcomers the conch shells I have drilled into the corners of my house, the seashells glued to the door frame of my front door, or the wind chimes made from pig bones that I have hanging from the porch. They'll also point out that I have a standing weekly order for a whole octopus at the local grocer, although no one has ever seen me eat it. The newcomers will ask if I'm some sort of hippie. The old-timers will say no, he just came back from the war with a few screws loose. No, not Vietnam, not Korea, the big one. WW2, I ain't that young. I don't help things, I know. I have my reasons for why I do the things I do. Until this morning, I'd never told anyone about what did happen to me during my time over there. Not my wife, not my kids, not even my folks really knew. Even when I run into other vets, I tell them yes, I served in the war, Marines, Pacific, Okinawa, occupation duty in China after it was over, separated and came home in 47. But that's about it. I'm sure they all think it's because my experiences were too traumatic or I'm shell-shocked. Everyone's heard the stories of the fighting on Iwo, Peleliu, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, places that have become etched into the national consciousness. Can't blame them for making assumptions. But no, my reasons are completely different. Hell, truth be told, I didn't even see any combat. By the time I was drafted, trained, and shipped out, the war was nearly over. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. But for me, it's because of specifically what happened right after the Japanese surrendered. In that first chaotic month. Something happened to me that, frankly, it just sounds insane. If I had told anyone what had happened, they really would have given me a Section 8 and sent me back stateside to a nice little white room with padded walls, if you catch my drift. I've struggled with it alone for the past 2 decades, but lately I've been starting to think maybe things were going to be okay after all. Maybe I had gotten away with it. But this morning when my daughter came running in holding Spud, lifeless in her arms, that damn mutt was always jumping the fence at night. I felt a chill run down my spine when I saw the bite marks. Something had mauled the poor mutt to death. Something with blue saliva. And then, I saw this morning's newspaper headline. I knew we were really in trouble. The monster from that night in 1945 had returned. On June 25th, 1945, I arrived at the replacement depot outside Naha, on the island of Okinawa. The island had been declared secure 3 days prior, although mop-up operations were still ongoing until the end of the month. While I'd missed the battle, everywhere I went, I could see the carnage that had been wrought. I don't know what the island looked like before the battle, but after, it was complete devastation. Towns were flattened. Naha, the main city, was just a pile of rubble, with the odd metal skeleton of a building standing in this sea of destruction. Nothing but bomb craters, mud, and rotting corpses. Human and animals, theirs and ours. Lots of civilians, too. Kids, women, old men. their bloated, rotting corpses decaying in the mud. You had to be careful with the dead bodies too, since the Japanese had booby-trapped some of them. The graves registration guys had their hands full. The air had this constant stench to it too. It was something I will never forget. It was this horrible combination of putrid, sickly sweet and acrid, stinging smoke that just lingered in the hot, sticky, humid air. And even though the fighting was over, you still had to be careful. There was lots of ordnance and minefields that still needed to be cleared. Also, there was always the possibility of some lone Japanese soldier holed up somewhere who was still hell-bent on bagging one more American before he went to meet his maker. Plenty of ways to get yourself a one-way trip back to the States in a pine box. Then there were the civilian survivors, wandering around, searching the rubble, nothing left but the clothes on their back. If there is a hell, I imagine it looks something like what I saw in Okinawa. I finally got to my unit on Independence Day. The rifle platoon I was assigned to had been badly mauled during the fighting. They'd lost their platoon commander and still hadn't received a replacement when I got there. Platoon Sergeant Davis was running the show. I ended up in Sergeant Perez's squad. Corporal Russell was in charge of my fire team. Over the next few weeks, other replacements filtered in, filling out the platoon. We finally got our platoon commander, a baby-faced Lieutenant Lewis. He couldn't have been much older than I was, probably was fresh out of officer candidate school. Even though the battle for Okinawa was over, at the time us lowly grunts were not privy to the fact that our country was developing the atom bomb, so we all fully expected that the next step would be the invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese would be fighting to defend their home islands, and they sure as hell would be throwing everything they had left at us. We underwent an intensive training program. It was tough, but I knew it was meant to give us a fighting chance at surviving the meat grinder we were surely heading into. The old guys in the unit sorted us greenhorns out, teaching us hard-learned lessons from their experience in prior campaigns. Towards the end of July, we rotated out of our bivouac on the south end of the island and headed up north, into the jungle where we could practice maneuvering through the brush as a unit. It was during this training that a storm, the remnants of Typhoon Opal, swept by the island. It brought rain, lightning, and strong winds. We hunkered down in the jungle, the ground beneath us turning to mud as we waited for it to pass. I pulled guard duty for the first half of the night. Taylor relieved me after my shift, and as I was walking back to camp in the dark, rain beating down on my poncho, I suddenly felt the ground give out beneath me. Next thing I knew, I was in pitch-black darkness in chest-deep water. Groping blindly in the dark with my hands, I found myself in a muddy hole not much bigger than myself. Thunder rumbled ominously off in the distance as raindrops fell, striking the water all around me. My hands brushed against something decidedly not mud. Wet fabric. There was a stiffness under it, cold with a little give. It was a body. I immediately tried to back away from it, a futile effort, I might add, since the hole was not much bigger than I was. The adrenaline kicked in. Had I stumbled on top of a Japanese holdout? Was I about to feel the cold steel of a bayonet stab into me? I got my answer as lightning crashed across the sky, and the light flashed across the face of a dead Japanese soldier, partially buried in the mud wall. It had been a brief moment, but I had seen that his flesh had started to slough off, the white of his cheekbones and the orbit of his eye sockets peeking through the decaying gray flesh of his face. I had seen plenty of dead bodies since I'd arrived, but something about the unexpected way this one had appeared and how close I was to it. Far too close. I felt my nerves fray. I desperately clawed at the muddy sides of the spider hole trying to climb out, but each time my hands garnered no purchase, coming away with only mud, and each time I slid a little further down, a little closer to the dead soldier. I don't know how long I was there for, clawing like a desperate rat. The next thing I know, I was standing topside. Sergeant Perez was yelling at me to pull myself together, and my face stung. I had nightmares for weeks afterwards. I was back in that spider hole, but this time the dead soldier would rise up out of the mud and grab me. a devilish grin spreading across his rotting face as its bony hands pulled me into the mud. It was not long after that we got the first news reports that a new weapon had been used on Japan. The atomic bomb. A single bomb wiping out an entire city. It was mind-boggling. We waited with bated breath for more news. And in the meantime, we continued to train. When news of the Japanese surrender reached us, celebrations broke out immediately all throughout camp. Laughter and cheers rang out, Marines broke out smokes congratulating one another. The mood was joyous. We were going home. Or so we thought. 2 days later, orders came in. A mad dash was on to get our troops into Japanese-held areas. While our division was being sent to northern China, our battalion was being temporarily detached and sent into the Amami Islands, which was a string of islands just north of Okinawa and in between us and Kyushu. Once other American units were ready to relieve us, we would join our fellow Marines in China. But in the meantime, some 20,000 Japanese troops were posted in the Amami Islands, and they needed to be disarmed, processed, and detained. Within our battalion, our company was going to be the tip of the proverbial spear. Our job was to land on Amami Island itself, near the main port of Naze, and construct a POW camp so we had somewhere to send the Japanese soldiers after we'd disarmed them. The whole operation was a rush job. We landed on Amami Island on September 3rd, the day after they signed the official documents on the Missouri up in Tokyo Bay. The initial landing was our rifle company, a section of Seabees, and 2 Japanese-American U.S. Army translators. It was surreal landing at the port. Coming ashore, watching as Japanese soldiers from the garrison guarding the port stood at the pier lined up at attention to receive us. Their officer with his samurai sword in hand waiting for us, like we weren't just trying to kill each other just a few weeks ago. Tensions were definitely on edge as we watched our company commander, Captain West, and one of the translators walk up to the Japanese officer. It was all very formal. We watched as the officers exchanged salutes, then the Japanese officer bowed with his sword held out in his hands. Our captain took it, then the Japanese soldiers laid down their rifles and marched into their barracks. And that was it. We'd taken our first group of Japanese prisoners. The captain posted a guard on the barracks. We needed that POW camp built pronto. As it turned out, there was not any readily apparent spot for the POW camp. We wanted a location sufficiently close to the port, but also far enough away that we could keep them separate from the civilians in town. We would have to clear away some of the jungle, if we were to have our camp. To make the work go quicker, it was decided to hire some of the local civilians. We promised some sea rats in exchange for a day's labor. Although the island was relatively unscathed from the ravages of war, save for some airstrikes, the port had still taken some damage during the war, and thus the Seabees were preoccupied with making it fully operational again. It would be up to our platoon to do the initial work of supervising and clearing the site for the camp. Lieutenant Lewis tasked our squad with directly overseeing the civilian laborers, while the other squads provided security. In those early days, we were stretched very thin indeed. One of the translators had helped us to recruit and explain the task to the laborers. However, because there were only 2 translators on the island at that time, they would not accompany us to the work site. Sergeant Perez figured that we would be fine with the rudimentary level Japanese he and a few other Marines knew. After all, the task was simply to cut trees down. We managed to wrangle together about 50 Japanese laborers out of Amami City. Together with the 13 members of our squad, we headed out into the jungle. Everything was fine on the way over, but as we neared the work site, the laborers started to become visibly disturbed. When we finally reached the site, one of the workers started shaking his head no. The laborers were chattering in Japanese and seemed very agitated. Sergeant Perez made a chopping motion with his arm toward the jungle. "No chop, no food," he said. The laborers shook their heads and held up their hands in protest. We were bewildered. They had agreed to do this, and now that they were here, they were refusing. A couple of the workers turned around and began to start walking back in the direction of the town. Corporal Russell ran over and cut them off, his rifle at the ready. "No, you work. You get gohan, food. No work, no gohan." The workers backed up, eyeing Russell's rifle nervously. But still, they refused to work. We were at an impasse. Sergeant Perez was exasperated. He turned to Corporal Morris. "Morris, take your team back to town. Appraise the LT of our situation." A short while later, Corporal Morris and his Marines returned with Lieutenant Lewis and one of the translators, a Sergeant Nakamura. It turned out that the Japanese civilians believed that some sort of tree spirit or creature lived in the jungle. One of the laborers, an old man, guided us a short way into the jungle to the foot of a large banyan tree. He explained through our translator that it was specifically this tree that the creature, Kenmun, lived in, and that anyone who harmed the jungle would be cursed by the creature. The lieutenant was visibly annoyed. The conversation between him, the translator, and the Japanese laborers started getting louder, and before long, Lieutenant Lewis was full on shouting. Since this was his first command, I think he was feeling the pressure to perform. It certainly wouldn't have reflected well on the lieutenant if we returned back to town without clearing the area, because the laborers said a tree spirit would be angry. He was losing control. The laborers started to crowd in towards the lieutenant, shouting back, the translator frantically trying to relay both sides to one another. The situation was growing unstable. Sergeant Perez motioned for the squad to close ranks with the LT. As we came abreast with the lieutenant, the laborers backed away. They were staring at our weapons. We wouldn't have fired on them, of course, but the laborers didn't know that. As the uproar died down, the lieutenant spoke a little more calmly, one final time. Sergeant, please ask his people, what will it take them to get the job done? Extra rations? Medical supplies? If a new deal needs to be struck, I will make it happen. But impress on them that we are not leaving here until the job is done. Sergeant Nakamura dutifully translated the instructions to the group of laborers. There was hushed talk amongst the group as they seemingly considered what the lieutenant had said. The old man who had shown us the tree earlier answered for the group. Sergeant Nakamura listened, then turned to the LT. Sir, they say if they are allowed to explain that they are being forced to do this against their will to the tree spirit, then they will cut the trees down. Nakamura paused for a moment. But they want you to know that the tree spirit will hold us responsible, and there may be, he says, punishment. Sergeant Nakamura shrugged his shoulders. Lewis looked relieved, like a large burden had been lifted. Thank God. Jesus, that was all they wanted? The lieutenant massaged his temples, then quickly added, Yes, absolutely. They can tell the goddamn tree spirit whatever they want. Hell, if it makes them feel any better, tell them this is a direct order from the big man himself, General MacArthur back at GHQ, just as long as the job gets done. The lieutenant walked away shaking his head as Nakamura translated the message to the men. The Japanese laborers nodded solemnly, then began walking slowly as a group towards the edge of the jungle. When they got to the tree line, I saw them grouped together. The old man was addressing the group of men. Then they spread out in a line and bowed deeply towards the jungle. Then they began to chant in unison, and as they did so, they finally began chopping. Makasa no meirei da, they chanted. Makasa no meirei da, over and over again. As we watched this bizarre display, I walked over to Sergeant Nakamura and asked him what it meant. MacArthur's orders, he answered. I raised my eyebrows at him, glancing over at the Japanese laborers, then back to him. Hey, don't look at me like that, man. I'm from Los Angeles. It took all day, but the work got done. Even the big banyan tree was cut down. As we rode back to town that evening, the Japanese laborers were noticeably silent. The next day, the Navy Seabees got to work building the POW camp. We were up and running in no time, and over the next few weeks, we began going out across the island, disarming the various Japanese units, and bringing them back to the camp for processing and internment. We would also go into town to distribute food and medicine to the locals, since civilian shipping still hadn't been restored. It was during these trips into town that I started to notice some of the houses had odd decorations. Seashells adorning the doorways, conch shells laid out in a ring around the house, pig bones laid out. I hadn't remembered these sorts of decorations on the houses the first time we came through. I also had seen a number of men catching octopus, but they didn't ever seem to eat them. They just left them outside their doors rotting, which seemed very odd given how scarce food was. Why go to the effort of catching it and just let it go to waste? During one of our food distributions, I recognized one of the laborers in the crowd. I asked Sergeant Nakamura to pull him aside and ask him about the shells, bones, and octopus. The man seemed uncomfortable, but answered it was for protection. Protection from what? The tree spirit, he answered. The octopus? The tree spirit fears the octopus, apparently. At the time, it seemed like foolish, superstitious nonsense. I know better now. I didn't recognize it for what it was when it happened, but I think my first run-in with this spirit, or as the locals called it, the Kenmun, might have happened a few days after that. This would have been in late September. We'd occupied the former Japanese Army Port Garrison's barracks and turned it into our base of operations on the island. On this particular night, I had pulled guard duty manning Gate 2 along with another Marine. Our shift had been pretty ordinary, pretty dull to be honest, until about 2 or 3 in the morning when both myself and the other Marine began experiencing some horrible headaches. The pain had come on suddenly and was intense. We felt it pulse in our foreheads and radiate into our eyeballs. It felt like pressure was building there, and then all of a sudden, the pain vanished for both of us as quickly as it had set in. When we looked up, we saw the outline of a man standing in the dark on the street outside the gate. I called out for the person to identify themselves. When no reply came, I grabbed the card Sergeant Nakamura had written up for us to read from in cases like this. It had a couple of possible commands on it. I read aloud the one that said to turn back now or be fired on. Again, there was no movement. The other Marine flipped on the big floodlight and aimed it down the road. As the light hit the man in the road, he immediately turned and ran into the jungle. But he had been visible long enough and clearly enough that I had no doubt about what I'd seen. It was the dead Japanese soldier whose spider hole I had fallen into on Okinawa, the one from my nightmares. I turned to the other Marine and asked him if he'd seen that just now. He was white as a sheet and nodded, shaking. I asked if he'd seen a dead soldier. At this, his face twitched and said that no, he hadn't seen that. He'd seen something else, he said, as he rubbed the crucifix he wore around his neck. I pressed him to tell me what he'd seen, but he wouldn't budge, just adamant it wasn't a Japanese soldier, alive or dead. Whatever he had seen had terrified him, though. On October 1st, our squad suffered a terrible loss. We had been supporting a clinic that medical had set up in one of the villages on the south end of the island. By this point, more units had come ashore, but translators were still a scarce commodity and were always in demand. So Corporal Morris and a couple of his Marines had gone back into town in a jeep to pick up Sergeant Nakamura and bring him to the village we were in. I remember it being just after we'd got finished eating our evening supper when a call came in over the radio. The voice was strained and in pain. Whoever it was kept saying there'd been a crash, send help. When we radioed back, there was no answer. Sergeant Perez was worried. He took our squad and some of the corpsmen out to find whoever had made the radio call. We didn't have to look long. A little ways down the road, where the road curves sharply, we found tire tracks that suddenly swerved and went off the road and down the embankment, which was quite steep, down into the jungle ravine below us. The going down was tough, the ground was steep, and it was easy to lose your footing. It took us a while to get down, but eventually we found the still smoldering jeep wrecked against the side of a banyan tree. Corporal Morris and the Marines who'd gone with him lay about the jeep dead. Sergeant Nakamura was still seated in the right passenger seat. A tree branch had impaled him through the gut. I saw him weakly lift his head, and I ran over immediately. The seat was soaked in blood. He'd been bleeding for some time. His face was pale. I yelled for a corpsman. Sergeant Nakamura tried to speak. His words were faint. I leaned in. As the corpsman rushed in, pushing me away, I caught Nakamura's faint last words. Kid, in the road. Sergeant Nakamura died before we made it back. We made a thorough search of the area, but found no evidence of a child, or anyone else for that matter. The mood in the platoon was decidedly somber afterwards. The morning of October 9th found us at our base in Amami City preparing to take a truck down to the south end of the island. The Japanese had constructed a network of large, well-built and dug-in bunkers and shore batteries along the southern end of the island that were known as Amami Fortress. While the Japanese troops that had manned the fortress had already surrendered, there were a number of fixed guns still in place. The Seabees and a number of other construction units were already down there working on decommissioning the fortress. Our forces were still spread thin, so our rifle platoon was being tasked to help out logistics with bringing a shipment of high explosive down to the fortress for any guns too large or cumbersome to remove. In the Marines, there's a saying, every Marine a rifleman, but on Amami Island in 1945, it should have been every Marine a truck driver. We sure did a lot of it. As we were loading the truck, I recall looking out over the ocean at the southern horizon. There was a band of black, thick storm clouds far out on the horizon. It looked sinister. Sergeant Perez noticed me looking and mentioned that fleet weather monitoring was forecasting the storm, Typhoon Louise, would stay well south of us out to sea and head into Formosa. All we were supposed to get was some windy rain. We were ready to leave at around noon. The leading band of the typhoon was still offshore a ways, but it had visibly moved closer. The wind had picked up, and it was now raining lightly, but we were ready to go, and fleet weather monitoring hadn't changed their forecast. Lieutenant Lewis had sent the other 2 squads ahead of us earlier in the morning. It was the lieutenant, Sergeant Perez, Corporal Russell's fire team, and Corporal Samuel's fire team. 10 Marines, including myself, all piled into one truck. Oh, and a case of high explosive. The trip would take about an hour and a half to get down to the south end. As the truck rumbled past the gates of our base, I couldn't keep my eyes off the clouds in the distance. The path south took us along the coastline of the island. Over the next hour, we watched as the surf offshore went from choppy to furious, with the waves surging up the beach, the occasional wave spilling onto the roadway. The rain had increased in intensity, coming down in sheets now, and the sky had turned black, and we needed to use the vehicle's headlights to cut through the gloom now, despite it being daytime. It was clear that the Navy pukes at Fleet Weather had made a mistake, a big mistake. Far too late, a radio call came in. Fleet Weather Monitoring had updated their forecast. The typhoon had suddenly changed directions to the north. Its new path brought it perilously close to Okinawa and the Amami Islands. The radio call ended with a general order for all units to seek immediate shelter due to the danger posed by the weather conditions. The deteriorating weather conditions had slowed our pace, and when the shelter order came in, we were about halfway between Amami City and our base, and Amami Fortress, where we were headed. We pulled over on the side of the road, watching the raging surf inching dangerously close to the road. Lieutenant Lewis and Sergeant Perez were huddled over a map of the island. It was clear we'd never make it to Amami Fortress or make it back to our base. We needed somewhere close by to ride out the storm. Our maps had been updated with the locations of the Japanese military installations on the island, and in that lay our answer. A communications bunker was only 15 minutes away from our current position, and it was on higher ground away from the surging ocean waves. The bunker had already been decommissioned and was abandoned. The road up to the bunker was windy and treacherous. Exposed to the fierce winds, the truck shuddered with every gust, but finally it leveled off and we went into the jungle, and the wind and rain were tempered somewhat by the jungle canopy. We pulled in next to the entrance to the bunker. We grabbed our personal kit and gear and made a hasty beeline to the bunker as the wind howled. A large heavy metal door lay open, leading down a set of stairs into the pitch-black dark of the bunker. We broke out our flashlights and proceeded inside. The walls of the tunnel were scored with the marks of hand tools that had been used to dig out the bunker, a crude and labor-intensive method. The first room we found ourselves in was completely empty. Whatever the Japanese hadn't taken with them, our boys had taken. There was a single light fixture on the ceiling. The switch didn't work. A power line was tacked to the ceiling, leading down the only path forward, a tunnel leading deeper into the bowels of the bunker. So we pressed on down and came out into the second room. This one was nearly empty, but there was a large mound of snail shells in the corner of the room. Not far from the shells were 2 large black rings on the ground, situated underneath an air shaft leading to the surface. We'd seen this before in some of the caves and bunkers on Okinawa. It had been their mess hall. The Japanese had been reduced to eating snails at the end due to food shortages. The rings were from carbonization from where they'd cooked. There were 4 different tunnels, including the one we'd entered from, splitting off from the mess hall. The power line split and went down 2 of the 3 unknown tunnels. Lieutenant Lewis had us hold in the mess hall while he sent Corporal Samuels and his team down one of the tunnels with the power lines, with orders to investigate and return. A short while later, Samuels returned and reported the tunnel terminated at a T, with 2 small rooms on either side. One they believed to be the radio room. The power line had led to this one. The other they were unsure of, but surmised might have been the CO's quarters or staff room. In any event, both rooms were empty. Then it was our team's turn to check out the other tunnel, which had a power line. I took point. Corporal Russell illuminated the path ahead of me with his flashlight while I slowly walked down the dark tunnel, my rifle at the ready. Harris and Taylor brought up the rear with the BAR. As we came to the end of the tunnel, the power line led to a single room to the left. Even before we turned the corner, we could see something was casting a faint blue glow from inside the room. We'd found the generator room. As we entered the room, we caught a whiff of the most intensely foul smell coming from the area around the generator. It was like rot, a fishy rot, with an intense fermented garlic smell. The source of the blue glow was a mysterious iridescent liquid that was smeared on the generator, and it seemed the smell was coming from this liquid. Harris ran his finger through the liquid on the casing of the generator. Russell was cut short by Harris immediately dry heaving as he brought his finger up to his nose. Told ya. Harris stumbled out of the room, still retching. Taylor gestured to us that he'd keep an eye on Harris and followed after him. As if on cue, we heard Harris vomit out in the tunnel. Russell asked if Harris was all right, to which Harris answered that he was, just needed a moment. Russell and I turned our attention to the generator, looking for a way to turn it on. Then I noticed something odd, a rupture in the casing. At first glance, I thought maybe the Japanese had sabotaged it before they left. It wouldn't be the first time, but no, there was something off about this. Shining the light at the hole, I called over to Corporal Russell. "Looks almost like something chewed through the metal," Corporal Russell said. He was right. The foul-smelling liquid was caked, perhaps I should say slobbered, all over the edges of the twisted metal, and I could now make out what looked like teeth marks. In any event, the internals were a mess. So much for power or lights. The blue liquid slobber formed a trail up the wall and into the air shaft above the generator. We made our way back up to the mess hall. What sort of animal can chew through metal? Rats? I've heard of rats chewing through wires, but a jetty? Corporal Russell reported what we'd found, and the lieutenant and sergeant nodded, disappointed in the inability to turn on the lights, but understanding. Samuels and his team went after that and checked out the last tunnel. It led to the barracks and sick bay, both of which they reported were mostly empty save for some chairs and bed frames. We sat huddled in the dark of the mess hall waiting out the storm. Even down there, the rattle of the heavy metal door to the bunker could be heard as the fierce wind's topside blew against it. On the hour, the lieutenant would send 2 of us Marines up there with the portable radio to check on conditions and try to catch any updates being broadcast. As 2 o'clock became 3, then 4 in the afternoon, the typhoon showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed like it was intensifying. One of Samuel's Marines thought he got a partial transmission saying that the storm had stalled and was now increasing in strength. So we continued to sit in the dark, saving our flashlight batteries for when they were needed, and as the hours went by, normal human bodily functions took their toll. In other words, we needed to go use the bathroom. Going outside into the wind and pouring rain was unpleasant if not dangerous. So we decided to go down to the generator room to do our business. It smelled awful in there already anyways. The storm kept us bottled up, constantly hammering the bunker hatch. We sat in the dark, talking, smoking, trying to kill the time. It must have been around 7 p.m. when we noticed that O'Malley, one of the Marines from Samuel's team, hadn't returned from the generator room. We weren't terribly alarmed at the time. He could have been jacking it or just needed some more time to do his business, but it was long enough that we ought to check and make sure he hadn't tripped and knocked his head in the dark. The ground was pretty uneven in the bunker, so it wasn't out of the question. Since I was feeling like I had to go do my business soon, I volunteered to go down and check on him. I walked down there, and as I was turning the corner into the generator room, I was saying, "Hey, O'Malley, you better not have your..." I froze mid-sentence, as I saw something my mind didn't quite comprehend. My flashlight illuminated the corner of the room, and there were 2 legs hanging down from the air shaft and the ceiling. Now, I need to make something clear. These air shafts were just metal pipes, about 6 inches or so in diameter, and the 2 full-grown adult human legs were just hanging from this tiny opening. They were crammed in there, and because the hole was so small, they were kind of at like a 40-degree angle. It was sort of comical if it wasn't for the fact that both legs were completely red with blood. There was a constant flow of blood dripping down the legs, dripping on the floor, drip, drip, drip. It took my mind a moment to process what I was seeing, a second to recognize I was looking at the same boots I was wearing, marine boots. Those were O'Malley's legs. There was a little tug, and the legs went just a little further into the hole, a little dribble of blood coming down with the tug. It was dumb and pointless looking back now, but I ran forward and leapt up, wrapping my arms around O'Malley's blood-drenched legs. "I got you, man!" I yelled as I tried to pull down on the legs. There was a sudden and violent upward force as something sucked the legs up into the air shaft. As I was gripping the legs, I went up too until I smacked my head on the ceiling and fell back down. O'Malley was gone. The only evidence of anything I saw was the blood around the opening to the shaft, the pool of blood on the ground, and the stains on my own face and uniform. I shook my head. That knock on my noggin brought me back to reality. I grabbed my rifle and ran back up to the mess hall, yelling and shouting as I ran. "Something took O'Malley! Something took O'Malley!" I shouted, my flashlight dancing from one confused face to another. Sergeant Perez came over and physically grabbed me, told me to calm down, explain what I was shouting about. I explained what had just transpired, and the lieutenant immediately ordered Corporal Samuels and his team hold the mess hall, while the Lieutenant Sarge and Corporal Russell's team went back down to the generator room. Once back in the generator room, I explained once again what I'd seen. The lieutenant and Sergeant Perez stared up at that tiny bloody air shaft for a good hard minute. I could see, just like me, they were having trouble understanding what I was describing. Unfortunately for me, they hadn't had the advantage of actually seeing it with their own eyes. Sergeant Perez turned to the lieutenant. "Sir, we've missed something. We're most likely dealing with an unknown number of Japanese troops who are refusing to surrender." He flashed his light around. "We've missed a trap door or hidden passageway, something. The Japanese are excellent at concealing their points of ingress and egress. They probably came out when Private O'Malley was alone." The lieutenant's face was white. "Oh my God." "Sir, we need to take decisive action." Lieutenant Lewis nodded. Fall back to the first room by the hatch. We'll hold out there." "I wouldn't advise that, sir. We're on their turf. All it would take is one grenade chucked from a hidden passageway and we'd be done for. I recommend an aggressive posture. Take the initiative and neutralize the threat." "How do you recommend we do that?" "Deploy Corporal Samuel's team on overwatch outside the bunker. The enemy likely has a hidden path of egress other than the main entrance. We don't have the manpower to engage them here. They can come at us from any direction down here, but luckily we have those charges with us in the truck. I recommend we use the charges to blow the main entrance, then we comb the topside for egress points and blow them as we find them. Turn the bunker into a tomb for the enemy, sir." Lieutenant chewed on that for a moment, then nodded. "Make it so, Sergeant." With that, the sergeant turned on his heels, a snap in his step. Sergeant Perez ordered us back up to the mess hall, where Corporal Samuels and the other two Marines were waiting. The sergeant was in the middle of explaining what was going on to Samuels and the other Marines when Taylor shouted, "Sarge, something's up by the entrance." He pointed up the dark tunnel leading to the first room and the hatch to the bunker. We all turned at once to see a faint blue flame floating in the darkness of the tunnel. We didn't need to be told. Everyone moved across the room, taking up defensive positions. "Kill the lights," Perez in a hushed voice, and as the flashlights kicked off, plunging us into darkness, the last thing I saw was Harris prone in front of me, setting the BAR up on its bipod. I shouldered my own rifle, aiming at the flame. The blue flame slowly bobbed down the tunnel towards us, accompanied by soft footsteps against the rocky stone floor, echoing through the tunnel. "O'Malley? That you?" Perez's voice shouted through the darkness. The little blue flame stopped. Silence. And then the flame went out. Corporal Perez opened fire with his carbine, and the rest of us joined in. 2 carbines, 2 BARs, and 5 rifles, all firing, pouring hot lead down the tunnel. The sound was deafening as the gunshots were amplified by the bunker's interior. each muzzle flash illuminating the darkness for a fraction of a second, granting us snapshots of our surroundings. I didn't see the enemy in the tunnel, but right before the gunfire ceased, I thought I caught rapid movement coming towards us above on the ceiling. I only got a momentary glimpse, but it was small, like a little red toddler scurrying across the rocky ceiling above. As the firing stopped and we were plunged back into darkness, I heard something fall and land behind us. Before I could even turn around, I heard Perez scream out in agony, a carbine firing wildly behind me. I heard someone to my right yelp in pain. I ducked for the floor, catching flashes each time Perez fired, of something red and hairy latched onto his back, its head buried in Perez's neck, gnawing on his throat as he fired. We heard Perez's body hit the ground, and then another Marine was screaming. "Get it off! Get—" The voice turned into a frothy scream. "Infiltrators! Lights on! Check your targets!" Someone, I think Samuels, shouted. As we flipped our flashlights on, we saw Sergeant Perez lying dead on the ground. Taylor slumped against the wall with a gunshot wound to the side of his chest, and this thing, about the size of a child, except with unnaturally long legs and arms, and covered in red fur, latched onto the neck of one of Samuel's Marines. The Marine appeared in shock, his BAR dangling from his hands. The face of the creature was a strange mix of human and animal. It had a short snout, which was slick with blood, and blue saliva was drooling from its mouth. It didn't look at us, or even seem to pay us any regard, just chewing on the poor Marine's neck. "My God, what the hell is that?" Lieutenant Lewis gasped. We didn't have a clear shot at this thing, not without hitting our fellow Marine. Corporal Samuels and the last remaining Marine on his fire team both drew their K-bars and approached the creature, attempting to rescue the stricken Marine. The creature looked up, its face without expression or emotion, just dumbly chewing on the flesh it had ripped from the man's neck, and balancing on its legs, it raised its arms up with its hands open at both Samuels and the other Marine. Twin jets of blue flame raced forth from the fingertips of the monster, engulfing both of the would-be saviors in flames. The men fell back screaming and swatting and trying in a desperate futile effort to extinguish the flames. The rest of us, the lieutenant, Corporal Russell, myself, and Harris with his BAR, opened fire in sheer panic. The creature leapt through the air, arms outstretched towards Harris, the fingertips already alight with blue flame. With a gymnast's grace, the creature landed on Harris's chest, its hands grasping Harris's head, and in an instant, Harris's head erupted into a blue funeral pyre. I know for a fact Harris hit the creature multiple times, to say nothing of the rest of us. It just seemed to stagger the creature, but otherwise had seemingly no effect. "Outside now! Go!" screamed Lieutenant Lewis. I turned to Corporal Russell. "Go, I'm right behind you," he said. He shouldered his rifle and fired at the creature, buying us the time to make it to the entrance. Just as the lieutenant threw the hatch open, I heard his agonizing scream behind us. We emerged into the still night air. I looked at the sky to see in the moonlight a circular wall of clouds all around us. We were in the eye of the typhoon. "Hold that hatch shut, Marine," the lieutenant ordered me as he ran to the truck. I slammed the door shut and did as I was told, leaning against the metal door to keep it closed. I felt a thud as something impacted the metal. The monster was on the other side trying to push it open. I leaned in with everything I had, trying to keep it shut. There was another thud and the hatch buckled open, just long enough for a furry hand to shoot out. I slammed the metal hatch back down on the hand, but it held firm. Slowly, the creature started to push the hatch open. Gunshots rang out from the other side of the door. Someone inside the bunker was still alive. The hand darted back, allowing me to fully close it again, and the beast was gone for the moment, presumably to deal with whoever was shooting it. The lieutenant came running back. He had several satchel charges in his hands. They were already primed. "Go, get to the truck," he shouted as he began placing them at the hatch. We ran like Olympians, practically leaping into the cabin of the truck. The lieutenant climbed into the driver's seat as a massive explosion rocked the night sky. The entrance to the bunker was no more. We didn't know how long we'd be in the eye of the storm. There was no time to celebrate or mourn. We had to get somewhere before the eye passed and we were back in the typhoon. The lieutenant started the truck and floored it, heading back into the jungle. We drove in silence until the truck exited the jungle and we came back out on the coastal road. The lieutenant began frantically rambling as he drove. "What was that? What the hell was that? I don't understand. No, this isn't happening." I sat, probably in shock, not saying anything. What happened next occurred so fast I didn't have time to react. All I saw was a lanky red blur in the moonlight emerge from the jungle running parallel to the road, and then it suddenly veered towards us and slammed into the side of the truck. The truck was off the road and out of control, the lieutenant desperately wrestling with the steering wheel. No, the lieutenant exclaimed just before the truck slammed into a large tree, and everything went black. I awoke to the sound of a fire burning and feeling myself being dragged by one leg across the ground. I looked up and saw the wrecked truck, the lieutenant's body hanging through the shattered windshield, lifeless. A fire was burning under the engine, and fuel from the gas tank had caught fire, and the fire was spreading. I looked down and saw that thing had me. It was dragging me towards the beach. A wave of terror washed over me, but I didn't have the strength to resist. Then there was a thunderous explosion from the direction of the truck as the fire reached the explosives. I flinched. The monster didn't. The monster dragged me onto the sand and near the water's edge. It placed one hand on my chest, restraining me, and looked at me with those glassy, emotionless eyes as it cast flames with its free hand and began to burn my hand, starting at the fingertips. I screamed in pain as I felt the skin blister under the searing heat. Flesh searing, fat bubbling, I could smell my own flesh cooking. I felt an oppressive, painful presence push into my mind, just like the headache I'd had the night of guard duty. I now understood it had been this creature. There was physical pain coming from my hands and in my head, but in my mind I was flooded with emotions not my own. I felt intense hate and anger, a feeling of having been wronged. My whole body was shaking violently as this creature worked the flame up now to my wrist. But in my head, I glimpsed an image of us in the jungle on that day we'd had the laborers from the village cut down the trees for the POW camp. I saw the argument the lieutenant and the laborers had had. An image of the laborers bowing to the forest. I heard them chanting, "Makasa no Mereda," as we stood behind them with our guns. I felt fear. I saw the jungle with all the trees chopped down, and I felt loss. Then I saw just us, the Marines and Sergeant Nakamura, who had been there that day, and I heard a deep, ancient, powerful voice, "Makasa," and I felt hate. As I lay in horrible pain, I had a realization. This thing, it didn't really understand what or who Makasa was. It thought we were MacArthur. It probably didn't really understand Japanese, not really, not any more than English anyways. In my desperation, I tried one last desperate gamble. I shouted in between my own agonized screams, "Makasa no Mereda," over and over. And at the same time, in my mind, I tried to picture as hard as I could General MacArthur's face. And I screamed over and over, "Makasa," holding his face in my mind. The flame stopped. I felt surprise, confusion, and then images from all over the island popped into my head, like a slideshow. I understood its meaning. It was asking, where? I pictured the island of Amami. Then I pictured a map and showed it where Tokyo was in relation. In my mind's eye, I then showed the thing an image of the creature itself sneaking into one of the large shipping crates at the port by our base. I pictured the crate moving from the island to Tokyo. I then pictured the creature coming out of the crate and next to General MacArthur. Then, next thing I felt was the presence in my mind recede, and the monster smacked me on the head, knocking me out. The creature must have dragged me to high ground, because when the corpsman woke me up, I was leaning against a banyan tree up on the hill, overlooking the beach. It was the next morning. They'd sent out a rescue party after we didn't report in. Because of the typhoon, they assumed that we'd crashed in the storm, a fire from the wreck ignited the explosives, destroying the truck, and the bodies of the other Marines were assumed to have been washed out to sea by the storm surge. The doc figured that I had wandered up the hill after the accident and didn't remember due to a concussion. I didn't do anything to correct the narrative. After all, who would believe my story about a little red-haired telepathic monkey monster killing my entire squad? I was transferred back to Okinawa and then Tripler in Hawaii to recover, before eventually rejoining my division in China. You might be wondering, if I managed to convince the monster not to kill me back in 45, why do I continue to do all these weird things to protect my house from it? Well, you see, I didn't actually know where those shipping crates were going. Certainly, they weren't all going to Tokyo. Most were headed to China since the battalion was being transferred. Some to Korea, others were bound for the US. There was a very good chance the monster ended up somewhere other than Tokyo. I doubt he appreciated that much, probably thinks I tricked him. So you see, when I noticed the blue saliva and the bite marks on Fido, I was worried. And when I saw in the newspaper that General MacArthur had passed away at Walter Reed yesterday, I knew we were in trouble. One was a coincidence, but both together, no. It was finally here, my day of reckoning. For the first time ever this morning, I told my wife and kids this story. I told them we needed to stay inside the house until I could figure out our next move. We'd be safe inside. They didn't take it well. They said I needed help. Psychiatric help. The argument got heated and my wife left for her mother's with the kids in tow. It probably didn't help that I was begging them to take one of the frozen octopus from the freezer as they left. I may be safe in the house right now, but they're in danger. My back's against the wall on this. I stay here and that thing will take out its vengeance on them. I don't have any choice. No, staying here isn't an option. It's me it wants after all. I know this is probably going to end badly, but I have to do something. I've got my 12 gauge loaded with 00 buckshot, my old K-bar, and a freezer full of octopus loaded in the truck. It'll have to be enough. It'll be enough. Thank you for watching. Tonight's fictional tale is very loosely based on some of the more recent folklore surrounding a yokai from the Amami Islands known as the Kenmun. But first, a little background on the Amami Islands themselves. The Amami Islanders have a shared Ryukyu and heritage with their Okinawan cousins. In their early history, they enjoyed autonomy and had their own language. Amami Islanders were engaged in trade with their neighbors, exporting shells to Song Dynasty China, and also with Japanese traders in Kyushu and their Okinawan brethren. There are also some theories that they may be the source of pirate raids made against Kyushu around the first millennium. Contemporary suspicions were strong enough that at least one punitive raid was undertaken by the clans on Kyushu at the time. By the mid-1200s, they were in a tributary relationship with the Ryukyu king on Okinawa. Starting in 1430, the Ryukyu kingdom undertook a military campaign to seize the Amami Islands. This invasion was completed in 1466, and the Amami Islands became part of the Ryukyu kingdom. In 1493, the Satsuma clan from Kyushu attempted to invade Amami Island, but were defeated by Ryukyu forces. During the late 1500s to the beginning of the 1600s, trade between Ming China and Japan came through the Ryukyu kingdom. Ming China had a trade policy called haijin in place that meant that official trade could only occur through designated tributary states. This policy was the legacy of an ultimately ineffective attempt in the late 1300s to combat Wako pirates based out of Japanese waters by restricting where and how trade was conducted. Despite its ineffectiveness, the Ming Chinese kept it in effect. Due to these policies, the Ryukyu Kingdom, a tributary of Ming China, grew rich from acting as the intermediary between Chinese and Japanese trade. Since there was no official diplomatic relations between the two parties and direct trade was officially banned by Ming China. Japan was not the only trade route going through the Ryukyu domain. Lucrative trade with Southeast Asia also flowed through here. The Satsuma, with the Tokugawa shogunate's blessing, invaded again in 1609. The fighting was fierce, but this time the Satsuma were victorious, eventually capturing even Shuri, the capital of the Ryukyu kingdom on Okinawa. The result was that the Amami Islands were annexed by the Satsuma, and the Ryukyu kingdom became secret vassals of the Satsuma clan, and by virtue Edo. The Ryukyu kingdom was allowed to continue to nominally remain independent and continue its tributary status with Ming China because the Satsuma wanted to control the trade between Japan and China, and if China knew the Ryukyu kingdom had in fact fallen to Japan, trade would have ceased. There was also some concerns in Edo that Ming China might decide to respond militarily if they learned of the full extent of what had transpired. So what does this have to do at all with the Kenmun? Well, the Kenmun as it is known today is a product of the Japanese cultural influence brought by the subjugation of the Amami Islands by the Satsuma. It is either wholly a local derivation of the famous kappa from the mainland, or possibly a blending of kappa and some ancient local folklore. The first written record of the Kenmun appears in a work titled the Nanto Zatsua, composed sometime in the 1850s by a Satsuma clan retainer sent into exile on the islands. This record was a collection of the writer's observations on local customs, wildlife, plants, industry, and folklore. In these initial accounts of the folklore, the Kenmun is described as a small creature, monkey-like, with red or black fur and limbs that are disproportionately long for its size. It is said to be about the size of a child. The face is described as resembling that of a monkey, dog, or cat. The Kenmun, in some descriptions, was said to have a slight depression on the top of its head, much in the same fashion as a kappa. And just like the kappa, this depression or bowl was filled with water. If the water was spilled, the Kenmun was said to lose its powers. Unique to the Kenmun, it was said to have foul-smelling blue saliva that glowed in the dark, but its body smelled of yams. The Kenmun was said to be sensitive of how it smelled and would grow upset if it heard people saying it stank. Perhaps its most notable feature was that it could emit fire from its fingertips, which it was said to use at night to look for food. Lights seen in the forest, jungle, or out on the beach at night were known as Kenmun machi. In one variation, instead of water in the depression on the top of its head, it was said to be filled with oil, and the Kenmun could light the oil on fire at night to hunt. The nature of the Kenmun was said to be mostly peaceful, even friendly. It was said that the creature would spend its time in the jungle eating snails. A banyan tree with a large amount of empty snail shells around it was a sure sign that a Kenmun had taken residence there. At night, it could be found on the beaches fishing. It especially was said to be fond of fish eyes. The Kenmun was known to be helpful to humans. It would help loggers carry wood, and in exchange for being allowed to eat one of the fish eyes, it would fish on behalf of fishermen. Also, much like the kappa, the Kenmun had an appreciation for sumo, and was said to eagerly challenge people who encountered it to a vigorous match. The Kenmun had an antagonistic relationship with octopus, and in one tale, a fisherman came upon a Kenmun being harassed by the cephalopod. The fisherman chased off the octopus and was rewarded with a great treasure. It was said that if one wanted to chase off a Kenmun, throwing or even just the mere threat of throwing an octopus at it was an effective method. The Kenmun also had a mischievous side, and to this end could purportedly shapeshift, assuming the form of animals and even people. It was said to sometimes assume the form of a guide and take hapless travelers into the middle of the jungle before disappearing and leaving them to find their own way out. On occasion, the Kenmun was known to throw rocks at night at passerbys. The Kenmun, as described here, is very similar to the Kijimuna, a yokai from Okinawa. As the Edo period drew to a close, Kenmun folklore took a darker turn. The mischievous aspect of the Kenmun became amplified, and the stories of a peaceful or helpful tree spirit all but stopped. In these newer stories, the Kenmun abducted children at night and stole their souls. The soulless children were said to become like the Kenmun themselves, mindlessly running around the jungle, eating snails, and climbing up into the banyan trees. In some accounts, it was possible to rescue the children by making a pot lid out of straw, placing the lid on the child's head, and then whacking them with a stick. I was not able to find an explanation for why this supposedly restores the child's soul. In other stories, the Kenmun ambushes adults who wander into the jungle at night, or have wronged the Kenmun somehow. The Kenmun sucked their souls out as well, and then fed these poor individuals slugs and snails. The affected individuals would be found underneath banyan trees the following morning, alive but disoriented. In the most extreme cases, which were quite rare, the Kenmun would drag its victim into the water and drown them. The Kenmun also was very protective of its home. Those who cut down the trees it inhabited were liable to be cursed by the yokai. An affliction of the eyes was a common curse, the symptoms being painful swelling, blindness, and on rare occasions, eventual death. During the final stages of the Second World War, when U.S. aircraft were flying overhead and carrying out airstrikes on the island's installations, it was said that the Amami Islanders sometimes sought out safety under the banyan trees. Unfortunately for the islanders, the Kenmun was known to steal their foodstuffs while they hid. This now brings us to the folklore that is the basis for tonight's tale, the final addition to the Kenmun's lore. After the war had ended, U.S. forces arrived on the island and, just like in my story, had the locals clear away a section of jungle to construct a POW camp. The islanders were fearful of the Kenmun's curse but carried out the order, chanting Makasa no Meireda, MacArthur's orders, so the Kenmun would know who was responsible. According to the tale, soon after this, the Kenmun vanished from the islands. Islanders claimed the Kenmun had left to find General MacArthur and curse him. When news reached the islands in 1964 that MacArthur had passed, locals started seeing the Kenmun again, and it was said that the yokai had returned now that its job was done. As outlandish as this tale is, this bit of folklore is recorded in numerous places. On the web, including the Japanese language Wikipedia article on the Kenmun, along with a number of books on the Kenmun and Amami Island folklore. It is, however, noticeably absent from the official local government's tourist information about the folklore of the Kenmun. This last bit of folklore might be a commentary on the American occupation of the Kenmun Islands. Since the Satsuma annexation, the Amami Islands have been part of modern-day Kagoshima Prefecture in Kyushu. At the very end of the war, during the initial discussions between U.S. military commanders and the garrison commander of the Japanese forces on the Amami Islands, the Japanese general repeatedly insisted that the Amami Islands were part of Kagoshima and not part of Okinawa. The Japanese general even initially refused the surrender order issued by the U.S. because the wording on the official document referred to the Amami Islands as the Northern Ryukyu Islands. U.S. commanders amended the order to name the islands individually, and the order was accepted by the Japanese general. As it turned out, the general was a local man and a descendant of the Satsuma clan. Ultimately, his efforts were in vain as the Amami Islands, along with Okinawa and the surrounding area, fell under direct U.S. military administration separate from the rest of Japan. The occupation was intensely unpopular on the Amami Islands. The locals complained that the islands were neglected by U.S. occupation authorities, and instead all resources and attention were poured into rebuilding Okinawa and the construction and expansion of U.S. military bases over there. Protests and hunger strikes were organized over the following years. On December 25, 1953, the islands would be turned back over to Japanese administration in what was called a Christmas present at the time. Okinawa, in contrast, would remain under U.S. control until 1972. While I don't know if I'd advocate anyone racing out to change the history books, the Kenmun folklore involving General MacArthur is certainly a unique bit of lore when it comes to yokai of Japan. It's certainly an unusual story that is based on the history and culture of the Amami Islands and involves the demise of one of the most famous Americans of the 20th century. I don't know of any other yokai that can boast of such a feat. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Have a wonderful evening, and see you in the next installment of Ghostly Japan.